The gymnasium lights flickered the same way they had 15 years ago, and Daniel Reyes stood frozen in the doorway, his heart slamming against his ribs, because across the room, laughing at something someone said, was the one person he never stopped thinking about, Elena Martinez, wearing that same easy smile that used to make him forget his own name. And in less than an hour she would walk up behind him, lean close enough that he could feel her breath on his ear, and whisper 5 words that would tear his carefully rebuilt life wide open. You still owe me that date. If you believe that some connections never really die, that second chances are real and kindness always finds its way back to us. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling me you're here for this story. Share it with someone who believes in the power of reunions. And subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss the next one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Daniel had told himself he wasn't going to the reunion. He'd told himself that for 3 weeks, ever since the invitation arrived in his inbox with its cheerful confetti graphic and the words Lincoln High Class of 2011 15 years later, splashed across the top. He'd stared at it, thumb hovering over the delete button, and then closed his laptop instead, because deleting it felt too final, and keeping it felt too dangerous. 15 years was a long time, long enough, he thought, to have stopped flinching every time he heard a certain kind of laugh in a crowded room, a laugh that always made him turn his head hoping and dreading it might be her. It never was. Elena Martinez had disappeared from his life the summer after graduation. The way people did before social media made disappearing impossible. And by the time he'd finally worked up the courage to look her up years later, she was already a blurry, half-updated profile picture, and a wall of privacy settings. He told himself it didn't matter. He had a life. He had an apartment in the city, a job as a structural engineer that paid well enough, a rescue dog named Biscuit, who greeted him every evening like he'd been gone for a decade, and a quiet, orderly existence that he had built, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of who he used to be in high school, the shy kid with the stutter that only came out around girls he liked, the one who spent an entire junior year working up the nerve to ask Elena Martinez to homecoming, only to watch someone else ask her first while he stood by the vending machines with $2 in quarters and a speech he'd rehearsed 40 times in the mirror. He remembered the exact moment he lost his nerve. It was a Tuesday. She was at her locker, laughing with her friends, sunlight cutting through the hallway window and landing right on her. Like something out of a movie he'd never admit to watching twice. He'd walked halfway down that hallway with his heart in his throat, and then Marcus Webb tall, easy, effortlessly confident Marcus Webb had beaten him to it by 30 seconds. And Daniel had turned around and walked straight into the boys' bathroom to catch his breath, telling himself it didn't matter, telling himself there'd be other chances. There weren't. Not really. Not until now, 15 years later, standing in the doorway of a rented-out gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and old dreams, wondering if coming here had been the biggest mistake of his life, or the thing he'd been waiting for without knowing it. He almost turned around. His hand was actually on the door when a voice behind him, warm and familiar in a way that hit him like a physical thing, said his name. Daniel Reyes, I didn't think you'd actually show up. He turned, and there she was. Elena Martinez, 15 years older and somehow more herself than he remembered, the same dark eyes that used to make his mind go blank, but now with faint lines at the corners that spoke of a life fully lived. Laughed in. Maybe cried in too. She wore a simple green dress, nothing flashy, and yet he felt like every other person in that gymnasium had faded into background noise. The second she spoke. I almost didn't, he admitted, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, though his palms had gone damp instantly, some old buried instinct kicking back to life like a light switch he thought had been permanently turned off. Well, I'm glad you did, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, soft, careful, like she meant it more than the casual reunion. Small talk, it should have been. Walk with me. It's a little loud in here. They ended up outside on the same concrete steps where 1,000 years ago they used to sit during lunch periods when the cafeteria got too crowded, back when their friendship felt like the safest place in the world, and Daniel spent every single day terrified of ruining it by saying the wrong thing. Or worse, the right thing. The night air was cool, the parking lot lights buzzing faintly overhead, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. the silence somehow comfortable and unbearable at the same time. I heard you became an engineer, Elena finally said. Buildings and bridges. That fits. You always liked things that made sense. Things you could measure. And I heard you became a nurse, Daniel replied. That fits too. You always took care of everybody, even when nobody asked you to. She laughed. A real laugh, and it undid something in his chest that he thought had healed a long time ago. Yay. Well, somebody had to look out for you. You never asked for help even when you clearly needed it. Remember junior year calculus? You'd rather fail silently than admit you didn't understand something. I remember, he said quietly. He remembered a lot of things. He remembered the way she used to save him a seat at lunch without ever making it feel like charity. He remembered the mixtape she made him for his birthday. Track list written in her looping handwriting. Half the songs about people who were too scared to say what they felt. He remembered thinking, even then, that she knew, that somehow she'd always known exactly how he felt about her, and had simply been kind enough never to make him say it out loud. Do you remember homecoming? She asked, and the question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading out in every direction. Daniel's stomach tightened. I remember, Marcus asked you first. He did, Elena said. But do you remember what I told him? Daniel shook his head slowly. He didn't. He'd never known. He'd spent that entire year assuming she simply hadn't wanted to go with him, assuming his silence had cost him nothing, because there had never been anything to lose in the first place. I told him I needed to think about it, Elena said, looking out at the parking lot instead of at him, her voice suddenly quieter, more exposed than he'd heard it all night. Because I was hoping you'd ask me first. I used to walk past your locker on purpose, you know. Every morning, I'd take the long way just so I'd pass by and maybe you'd say something. Anything. I waited 2 weeks, Daniel. 2 weeks of walking past that locker, hoping you'd finally get the nerve. The words hit him harder than he expected, an old wound he thought had scarred over splitting back open with startling ease. I didn't know, he said. I had no idea. I thought you and Marcus were just, I don't know, meant to happen. I thought I was invisible to you, like that. You were never invisible, Elena said, turning to look at him now, something fierce and a little sad in her expression. You were just scared. And I understood that because, honestly, so was I. I said yes to Marcus because I got tired of waiting, and I didn't want to spend homecoming night alone wondering what might have been. But it wasn't what I wanted. Not really. Daniel sat with that, for a long moment, the weight of 15 years of assumed history rearranging itself in his mind. All this time he'd told himself a story that he'd simply missed his window, that some things weren't meant to be, that Elena Martinez had never really seen him the way he saw her. And now here she was, telling him the truth had been the opposite the entire time, that his silence hadn't been the safe choice he thought it was, but the very thing that had cost him what he wanted most. I looked for you, he admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. After graduation, I tried to find you online for years. You just disappeared. I moved a lot, Elena said. Nursing school, then a residency out of state. Then my mom got sick, and I moved back home to take care of her. Life happens fast when you're not looking. I thought about reaching out so many times. I'd write messages and delete them. I told myself you'd probably forgotten all about me, moved on, found someone. I didn't want to be the person who showed up out of nowhere and made things complicated. You were never complicated, Daniel said. You were the one thing that always made sense. They sat in silence again, but this one felt different, charged with everything unsaid finally being said. 15 years of assumptions crumbling in real time between two people who had spent a decade and a half quietly wondering about each other from opposite ends of the country. Somewhere behind them, muffled music drifted out from the gymnasium, an old song from their senior year, the kind that used to play at every dance while they stood on opposite sides of the room, pretending not to notice each other. Is your mom okay now? Daniel asked gently. Elena's expression softened, gratitude flickering across her face at the question. She passed away 2 years ago, she said. It was hard. It's still hard some days. But I got to be there for her, at the end, which is more than a lot of people get. She used to ask about you, actually. She remembered you from that one time you drove me home in the rain when my car broke down. She said, Whatever happened to that sweet, quiet boy who never said much but always showed up when it counted? Daniel felt something thick rise in his throat. He remembered that night clearly, the rain hammering the windshield, Elena's laugh cutting through his nervousness, the radio playing something neither of them paid attention to because the silence between them had felt too important to fill with anything else. He hadn't thought about that night in years, and hearing that her mother had remembered it, had held onto it as some small proof of goodness in the world, made something in his chest ache, in a way he didn't have words for. "I'm sorry about your mom," he said quietly. "She sounds like she raised someone pretty remarkable." Elena smiled, a little sadly, a little gratefully. She'd have liked hearing you say that. They talked for what felt like hours after that, catching up on the small and large things that fill 15 years of a life. Daniel's divorce, 2 years prior. Quiet and amicable, but still a wound that hadn't fully closed. The kind of ending that leaves you questioning whether you were ever really good at loving someone the right way. Elena's own near marriage that fell apart when she realized, 3 weeks before the wedding, that she was more in love with the idea of being chosen than with the man himself, and how walking away from that had been the hardest and most honest thing she'd ever done. They talked about grief, about the strange way it reshapes a person, about how 33 felt both impossibly old and terrifyingly young at the same time, about how neither of them had expected to end up here, on these same concrete steps, still circling the same unfinished conversation from a decade and a half ago. At some point, the reunion inside began winding down, the music fading, classmates trickling out to the parking lot in loud, nostalgic clusters, calling out goodbyes and promising to keep in touch in the way people always do and rarely mean. Daniel knew he should probably go too. He had an early morning, a project deadline, a whole life waiting for him back in the city that had nothing to do with this gymnasium, or these concrete steps, or the woman sitting beside him, who had somehow, impossibly, made 15 years disappear in the space of a single conversation. But he didn't move, neither did she. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said finally, and there was a hesitance in her voice that hadn't been there before, something vulnerable pushing its way to the surface. "Anything," Daniel said. "If I had said yes to you back then, if you had asked me to homecoming instead of Marcus, do you think things would have turned out differently? For us, I mean." Daniel thought about it seriously, because the question deserved seriousness, deserved more than a reflexive romantic answer meant to please her. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe we would have dated for a few months, and it wouldn't have worked because we were 17 and didn't know anything about anything yet. Or maybe it would have been the start of something that lasted. I don't know, but I know I've spent 15 years wondering, and I think that wondering has cost me more peace than I ever admitted to myself." Elena nodded slowly, as if that answer, imperfect and uncertain as it was, satisfied something in her anyway. "I've wondered too," she admitted, "more than I probably should have, considering I built an entire life without you in it. But some people just stay lodged in you, you know? Like a splinter you stop noticing until you press down on the exact wrong spot." "I know exactly what you mean," Daniel said, and he did, more than she probably realized because he'd spent the better part of a decade and a half pressing down on that exact spot in quiet, private moments during his wedding vows to a woman he loved, but never quite the way he suspected he was supposed to. During long drives when a familiar-sounding laugh came on the radio in someone's interview, during the loneliest stretches after his divorce, when he lay awake wondering if he'd ever really given anyone his full, undivided heart, or if some part of it had been reserved this entire time for a girl he'd known for 4 years in high school, and never had the courage to properly love. The parking lot had nearly emptied by the time Elena stood, brushing off her dress, glancing back toward the gymnasium doors as the last few lights inside clicked off one by one. Daniel stood too, unsure of what came next, unsure if this had been a beautiful, closed-off chapter, or the reopening of something neither of them was prepared to name yet. "I should go," Elena said, though she made no immediate move toward her car. "It's late." "Yeah," Daniel agreed, though he didn't move either. They stood there for a long moment, close enough that he could smell the same perfume she used to wear in high school, faint and familiar and devastating in its nostalgia. And he thought, this is it. This is the moment where we say goodbye again, and go back to being strangers who once knew each other, And 15 years from now, I'll be sitting somewhere thinking about this exact conversation and wondering, again, what might have happened if I'd just said something. But he didn't have to wonder, this time. Because Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her, close enough that his heart forgot entirely how to beat at a normal pace, and she leaned in near his ear, her voice dropping to something soft and quiet, and only meant for him, and she whispered, "You still owe me that date." Daniel felt the words land somewhere deep in his chest, unraveling 15 years of quiet regret in a single sentence. He pulled back just enough to look at her, searching her face for some sign that she was joking, that this was just reunion nostalgia talking. The kind of thing people say under string lights and old memories that they don't actually mean once the sun comes up. But her expression was steady, open, brave in a way that undid him completely, because he understood in that moment that it had taken real courage for her to say those words. The same courage he had failed to summon 15 years earlier by a row of lockers on a Tuesday afternoon. "I don't have anything to offer you tonight," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "No car with the top down, no fancy restaurant reservation, just an old parking lot and a gymnasium that smells like floor wax." "That's not what I meant," Elena said, smiling now, something soft and hopeful breaking through. "I don't need grand gestures, Daniel. I never did. I just needed you to show up. That's all I ever wanted from you, even back then. I just needed you to show up. Then let me show up now," he said, and the words came out steadier than he felt. 15 years of fear finally giving way to something braver, something that had been waiting patiently this entire time for exactly this moment. "Have dinner with me. Not tonight, because it's nearly midnight and neither of us has eaten anything but stale reunion punch and crackers. But soon, this week. Let me take you somewhere with real food and real conversation, and let's finally have the date we should have had a long time ago." Elena's eyes glistened under the parking lot lights, and she nodded, laughing softly, wiping at the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. "It's about time, Reyes." They exchanged numbers standing right there in the parking lot, both of them a little giddy and disbelieving, the way people get when something impossible suddenly becomes very possible. And as Daniel drove home that night, windows down despite the cold, some old song from their senior year playing on the radio like the universe had a strange sense of humor, he felt something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 15 years. He thought about all the time he'd spent building a life around the absence of her, all the quiet Sundays and long drives and empty apartment evenings where some part of him had simply been waiting, without even realizing it, for this exact chance to make things right. Their first date happened 4 days later, at a small Italian restaurant with candles stuck in old wine bottles and a waiter who kept refilling their water glasses without being asked. They talked for 3 hours straight, the kind of conversation that makes time collapse in on itself, and somewhere around dessert Elena reached across the table and took his hand, and Daniel felt 15 years of missed chances finally settle into something like peace. It wasn't perfect. Nothing worth having ever is. There were long talks in the weeks that followed about grief, about old wounds, about the fear of being hurt again after everything they'd both survived. There were nights. Elena admitted she still sometimes flinched at vulnerability, still braced herself for people to leave the way her father had when she was 12. And nights, Daniel admitted, he still carried guilt from his divorce, still wondered if he was capable of loving someone the right way after failing at it once already. But they showed up for each other, night after night, conversation after difficult conversation, choosing each time to stay instead of retreat into the safety of silence, the way 17-year-old versions of themselves once had. 6 months later, Daniel stood in his kitchen watching Elena teach Biscuit to sit for a treat, laughing at the dog's stubborn refusal to cooperate, sunlight pouring through the window and landing on her exactly the way it had that Tuesday afternoon in the school hallway 15 years earlier. And he thought, this is it. This is what I was waiting for this whole time, without knowing it. Not a grand cinematic reunion, but this small, ordinary, real. A woman teaching his dog tricks in his kitchen on a Tuesday evening, choosing him again and again, in all the quiet, unremarkable ways that actually matter. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that it's never too late for second chances, that the people who matter most sometimes come back around, when we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. It genuinely means the world to me and to this channel. And before we go, I want to ask something special of you. If you believe, like Daniel and Elena did, that showing up for the people we love matters more than grand gestures ever could, comment the word second chance below. I want to see how many of you out there still believe in stories like this one. Elena moved in with Daniel the following spring, and on the one-year anniversary of that reunion night, he took her back to Lincoln High, back to those same concrete steps outside the gymnasium, now quiet and empty in the golden evening light. He got down on one knee right there, in the exact spot where she had once whispered 5 words that changed the entire trajectory of his life, and asked her to marry him. She said yes before he even finished the question, both of them laughing and crying at once. 15 years of longing finally resolving into something whole and complete and entirely, beautifully real. Because sometimes the people we let slip away come back to us exactly when we're ready to hold on properly this time. And sometimes all it takes is one whispered sentence, one moment of courage, to turn 15 years of silence into a lifetime of showing up. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe to Kindness Corner, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, and until next time, keep believing in kindness, in courage, and in the quiet, beautiful magic of showing up when it counts.